Evening, everybody. My name is Mark Smith, and on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries, I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight. Tonight's event with Dominic Amerena.
Thank you.
Discussing his debut novel, I Want Everything. I'd like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and the Gulajan and Gadabanud people of the Maar Nations as the original owners of the lands on which our library services operate. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. We've got some housekeeping to kick off. Tonight's event is being recorded. If you'd like to watch the discussion again or recommend it to friends or family, it'll be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel in the coming days. If you have any concerns about that, about the recording, please let our staff know, who you can see at the back of the room here. And on to the main event. I'm very pleased to have been invited to facilitate this evening's event with Dom. Dom's work has been widely published and anthologised. He's won numerous prizes, scholarships, fellowships and grants, and has a PhD from the University of RMIT. Dom lives between Melbourne and Greece, but he was originally from Geelong. And I Want Everything is his debut novel. So please join me in welcoming Dom Amerena. How long is it since you've lived in Geelong?
Well, I would say it was back when the cats weren't very good, so that was a really long time ago.
Okay. Pre-2007?
Yeah, it must have been. Okay. I think I moved just before they beat Port in the Premiership.
Okay. As your bio attests, you've been a successful writer before you've written this first novel, principally in literary criticism, prizes, fellowships, residencies, except all of those things that other writers are very jealous of. Did you feel pressure to write a novel, having had that success with short form fiction?
I suppose I'd always wanted to write a novel. Like, that was always my ambition. I've always been drawn to the novel as like the ultimate form of kind of creative expression, at least in my abilities, but I think it took me a while to learn how to do it. It took me a while to have the confidence to attempt a form that was a bit longer and a bit more complex. Like, there's a great saying by Faulkner, I believe it is, which is, writing a novel is like assembling a tornado, a chicken coop in a tornado, which is like, it's basically like you have to get so many things, they're flying around all the time, and you have to kind of condense them into a form that, is approachable and becomes something unified. And I think it takes a long time to learn how to do that. So doing shorter fiction is a way to kind of hone those skills and kind of crystallize the techniques that maybe you need to attempt something a bit longer, yeah.
And what did you bring the same processes then to writing long form? Did you adapt from short form using the same processes, or was this something entirely new?
Well, I would say, you can write a perfect short story, but you can't write a perfect novel. Like, you can have a short story that really works and is like self-contained and everything is there with this ultimate purpose, whereas a novel, by definition, sometimes you have to kind of let yourself go a bit more, and you let yourself kind of like be a bit more digressive, go in weird and strange places. And I don't think you can really when you start a novel, it never ends up where you think it's going to end up. It ends up in very strange and surprising places. And my novel had a very kind of strange process, which was I was writing this very long, very complex, very annoying, very horrible, very terrible novel, which was doing my head in. And the novel that, we now have in front of you emerged as a kind of side plot from this much longer novel. And I found myself kind of, there were a few scenes that I really liked and I was really enjoying writing, and I kind of had to give myself permission to dispense with the rest and kind of drill down into this relationship between these two characters, which became I Want Everything.
You say give yourself permission. That's letting go of a lot of work, though. And at what stage during the novel did that happen?
Well, I wish it would have been earlier, but it was far too late. You know, I had a full manuscript, and I won a bloody, you know, unpublished manuscript prize for it. And like, people are like, are you happy with it? And I'm like, no, I hate it. And I had to kind of like make this very difficult decision to just be like, well, do I actually like this book? And I didn't. And so I kind of had to start again. But once I did, it felt very freeing, and the novel came very quickly. And I don't know, it's something I've kind of taken from this whole process, which is like an intuition about a sense of fun with writing, where I became confident in the parts of the writing that I found really fun. That sense of energy and fun transmits to the reader. And so I think that's what I kind of have learned from this whole process, is to kind of like trust those instincts. I'm reminded the Australian writer Charlotte Wood has that saying that a novel reveals itself to you as you write it. Yeah.
It sounds as though you believe in that.
Yeah, definitely,
mantra.
definitely. I think, you know, you just have to kind of, like, it's quite grueling. Like, you have to sit down at your desk pretty much every day and write some words, and sometimes it's, you know, like a window opens up in your soul, and sometimes it's like horrible, and you just have to kind of trust the process, and eventually something comes from nothing, and the kind of way through becomes quite clear. I'm not sure whether you have a similar process.
Well, I've got a question around that process, because I've heard it said that yes, you do have that. You have that writing regimen, going back to it each day, and sometimes you feel as though it's flowing, and sometimes you don't. When you go back over a manuscript, can you tell on those? Can you tell the parts that were done when things we didn't think things were working as well, or alternatively where things were working very well?
That's an interesting question. I guess I feel like when you're forcing things, usually, you know, that indicates something about what the writing is going to look like in the final form. Like, if you have a preconceived idea of what this scene has to do, or what these characters need to say, or what this novel is doing, often I find that writing seems to be a little bit inert and a little bit kind of flat. And it's when you kind of like allow the energy of the sentences, or the energy of the characters, or the energy of the idea to kind of drive you forward, that, you know, you for me anyway, you end up with writing that you can kind of put your name to.
Yeah. Let's get on to I Want Everything. Can you give us, you must have the elevator pitch down pat by now, so let's have the elevator pitch.
Yes, this is week 6 of a 6-week book tour, so, you know, okay, so picture this. Okay, so I Want Everything tells the story of an unnamed young writer who's living in Footscray, and he has ambitions to be the next great Australian writer. The only problem is that he doesn't really want to write a book, and he has nothing to write about. So he is swimming off his kind of frustration at his situation when he encounters Brenda Shales, who is a cult author from the 70s, who wrote these 2 incendiary novels, and then mysteriously disappeared from the public eye. And through a deception that kind of snowballs into a kind of series of lies which he can't take back, he worms his way into her life and learns the secrets of what her novels meant and why she disappeared. How was that?
Very good.
Yeah, thank you.
How do we rate that out of 10 as an elevator pitch? The novel revolves around deception on so many levels. The deception of the unnamed protagonist, we should say, as well. I'll ask a question about that in a minute. So the deception of the unnamed protagonist in relation to Brenda. And the nursing home where she is, where she's living during this time. His own partner, Ruth, as well. There's a deception there, but also there's self-deception in the character. The constant realisation of how and why he is acting in the way that he is, knowing that what he's doing is entirely wrong, but still doing it. Can you comment on that aspect of the narrative?
Sure, well, I guess it's like, I guess I was interested in the idea of like, what is it that kind of drives like creative ambition and the kind of like libidinal kind of thrill of creative ambition, which can be kind of positive, and it can also be very kind of negatively charged. And I think these kind of negative states can be very interesting to explore as well. And I guess, I think every writer has this like strange compulsion in them where they're balancing kind of like ethics and ambition all the time. And some people way down on one side and some people way down on another side. And, I think this writer deludes himself into thinking, art is above everything, that any price is like, no price is too steep to pay to kind of create art. And I think this novel, contests that idea and kind of, revels in it as well, because I think it is about like art making and the kind of deceptions and sacrifices that artists make to kind of like get their name into the world.
What does it say about me if when I was reading this novel, I really wanted him to get away with it?
Yeah. No. It is I've heard this reaction before, and I think, it's a reaction I really like.
Yeah.
I've had people tell me, they're like, I really wanted to hate this book. Like I hate this narrator, but I also like want him to get what he wants. Yeah. And I think, I tried to kind of create a narrator which he is sympathetic in some ways, and he's sympathetic perhaps because, we see in him, a reader might see in him their own kind of like, less positive kind of drives and desires. And I hope that, it can kind of help people become more in touch with them. Yeah.
Ultimately, this has the potential to be a huge literary scandal. And Australia has had its fair share of literary scandals. I'm sure you've been asked this only about 20 odd times.
It's a great question.
Yeah. Do you think there's something, particularly in the Australian consciousness, about fakery?
Yes.
That may not be as prevalent elsewhere?
Yeah, I think, these kind of hoaxes and scandals are in all literary cultures. But I agree. I think, when these were really at the back of my mind when I was writing this novel, and, you go all the way back to the Ern Malley affair, which, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of it was this prank played on a kind of poetry journal back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, I can't remember, it doesn't matter. But basically they were lampooning modernist poetry, and they created a fake dead poet who wrote these poems, and the poems are actually pretty good. Yeah, they're not bad. And anyway, that all the way up to like the John Hughes scandal, where he was stealing parts of Svetlana Alexievich's
very recent one.
Yeah, very recent. That was 2018, I think. And then you go back to the 90s. There's Helen Demidenko, who's actually Helen Dale. There's Norma Curry. There's all these co-options of First Nations identities, like the Wanda Coolmetry scandal and things like that. There's endless examples of Australian kind of literary culture being exposed, and fraudulence being exposed. And I've been thinking a lot about it, and I don't think there's a simple answer what is particularly Australian about it. I wonder whether there's something going on with the settler unconscious in Australia, that there's a kind of perhaps deep-seated feeling of not belonging, or a feeling of inauthenticity, a feeling of kind of guilt, which comes out in these very strange ways. And writers especially are kind of tapping into this strange feeling of inauthenticity living in Australia, and that comes out in the books they write, I think.
I wonder if it's part of that Australian bullshit meter, where we're constantly on guard for things that may not be real, that may be fake. And I do wonder whether you've reflected whether that sort of fine-tuning about what's real or not is reflected in other parts of Australian society outside of the arts as well.
Well, I guess so. I often think about it with our politicians. It's like, we don't like charming politicians in Australia. We don't like anybody with charisma. We only like boring, kind of like custodial, like janitor, like kind of like, like office worker type politicians. And I think what you're saying is like, it taps into that. It's like, we want this kind of like dull, non-bullshitty kind of stable thing. And so I guess I would say that there's some sort of parallels there.
You're also making a point about, we were talking before about the ethical complexities of writing, about who has the right to tell what story and whose story, about gathering and using source material, and the line between inspiration and exploitation, because there's always a certain amount of things that are derivative.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to write something which is totally unique. Do you feel that in this writing life that you're engaged in now?
Yeah, well, I guess every writer, I would say writing that's even, very, very fictional or not related to the world that we live in, people are still drawing upon the world around them. They're drawing upon histories, they're drawing upon their families, they're drawing upon parts of their lives that are kind of part of them. And I think these ethical questions are really important. My novel kind of really does take them seriously, is what is a story and whose story is it and who can get to tell it? And, can somebody own a story? Can somebody not own a story? And it's been very interesting to kind of see the reception of, this novel, which, I suppose in some ways invites an autobiographical reading, but in some ways doesn't as well. But, I've had lots of people come up to me and be like, oh, so who is this old lady who you've deceived? And how what's your relationship like now? And, I have to tell them, well, we don't talk anymore. She's in the nursing home and I've abandoned her. And of course she doesn't exist. But it's very interesting the way that the real world is people see themselves in fiction. And, I do think when you're using other people's stories, you have to be very careful and you have to be very kind of if other people are implicated, a writer does owe them a right of kind of reply, a right of kind of input into those stories. But I think also it is a kind of it's a process where you can kind of use parts of your life as a jumping off board to kind of tell your own story. I always think of there's a great thing that Henry James used to do when he'd be at a dinner party and he would hear a great anecdote and he was like, oh, I like this. And he would stop the speaker before it finished because he wouldn't want to know the ending, because he would like to take the kind of setup and kind of use it for himself. And there is this kind of strange, cannibalistic impulse that I think lots of writers have when they're kind of the way that they inhabit their world. And, I have a funny kind of story about parts of very small parts of my novel were kind of very, very slightly inspired by things that had happened to, ancestors of my family. And a good example is I come from an Italian background and, I have this distinct memory of my grandfather before he died. We were having this conversation where he was telling me that his father had been interred in a labor camp in the Riverina during World War II, because a lot of Italian people and Germans were interred by the Australian government because they were suspected of being fascist sympathizers. And, that kind of stuck with me, and in a very kind of minor way it found itself into my novel, and I was quite happy with the scene. And, I eventually kind of went back to family members to kind of talk about this, and they told me, they're like, what are you talking about? This, nobody was interned in a camp. And I'm like, well, where did I get this from? Did I hear a podcast? And I either heard a podcast or I'd completely misremembered this story. And it was I was very careful to not be using this family story, which actually didn't happen. So yeah, it might be saying something about why I can't write non-fiction, because I'm a born fabricator.
That does happen in the inverse as well, where people find things in the novel that you had absolutely no intention of, read in that way.
Well, it's very funny, there's this one line, there's one reference to an ex-girlfriend who says something mean to the narrator, and my ex-girlfriend, who I'm quite good friends with, we were getting a drink and she's like, I would never say that. And I'm like, well, you didn't say that, and that's not you and that's not me, but but it's an interesting process.
With so much deception and duplicity in I Want Everything, number one, was it fun to write? Was it enjoyable to write? And did you feel at any time that you had to actually rein it in so that it didn't turn into farce?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know.
I guess that's part of the editorial process as well.
Definitely, yeah. And I was very lucky to work with great editors who kind of, restructured the novel in a way which kind of, made it really pop, I guess. But yeah, going back to what I said before, I I had real fun writing this novel, and it really did kind of teach me something about the type of writing that I think I want to write in the future, which is just feeling that kind of libidinal thrill while I'm writing. And I guess, I don't know, I've always cut my teeth as like quite a literary writer, and I think my novel is quite literary. You know, it's about Australian literary history, it's about, you know, the Whitlam years, it's about relationships and sex and deception and desire and all that stuff, but it's also very plotty, and like I had a real good time writing a plot. I'd never really done it before, and it was so fun to just kind of like ratchet the tension up and just kind of have reversals and kind of twists, and I'm like, oh yeah, I love this. And that kind of, it makes me think of Javier Marias, who's a very, very literary writer. He's a Spanish guy, and he had this idea that like you can write the most literary novel you want, but just have a murder or something at the start, and like people will kind of keep going. So I think that's what I'll do for my next novel.
Yeah. Even a novel though that can come across as lighter or fun for the reader, because this is great fun to read as well as it was to write. But that can often be a harder book to write than as you know, straight up literary fiction, a serious literary fiction.
Yeah, no. Well, like you know, I keep quoting all these people, but I think maybe it was Maya Angelou or something like that. She said, you know, easy to read is hard to write. And I think that's very true. I think it's like, you know, I think like perhaps some unsuccessful literary fiction, like it kind of hides behind the fact that it doesn't really think about the reader's enjoyment very much. Yeah. And I think like enjoyment is like very crucial in the artistic experience. And like, I think you can write the darkest shit in the world, but like it can still be enjoyable. It can still be kind of like thrilling. It can be kind of like funny. And I think like perhaps humor as well is maybe the quality I think that's most missing in most fiction. It's like all my favorite books are funny, even if they're about like, you know, the darkest shit in the world. Yeah.
And never underestimate the skill that goes into writing a page turner.
Yes, no, I totally agree. I think it's like, you know, it is a very, very difficult skill to keep people wanting to read something.
I want to delve into a couple of the characters.
Sure.
So the unnamed, was there a reason for the protagonist being unnamed? I just had to throw that one in there.
Well, I guess it's kind of like it's you know, there are kind of funny jokes throughout it about him being unnamed. I guess perhaps it's perhaps like referential to some tropes of autofiction, which this novel is kind of in conversation with, but more so I would say it is about, you know, his search for a sense of identity, which is like he thinks he will get this fulfillment through perhaps the existential void of his life through becoming famous as a writer, but of course he doesn't find that. But I mean, like perhaps that is where the unnamed part is referring to.
He does seem fixated on this idea of greatness in his writing career, while not being prepared to do the work.
Yeah.
It has to be said. But you contrast this brilliantly with his girlfriend, Ruth, who has had a modicum of success by doing the hard work, but he's deceiving her as well. Can you comment on the way you play these two characters off against each other, just to highlight that deception and the frailty, I suppose, in their relationship?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. And I think, you know, I often think of my book sort of structured, it's sort of like a love triangle, but not in a kind of sexual sense, maybe in a more like intellectual or kind of like affective sense, where you have like the unnamed narrator, you have his girlfriend Ruth, and then you have the Brenda character, who all represent kind of different aspects of like the writing life, where Brenda is this kind of reclusive figure who symbolizes this high art where she kind of eschews the kind of public attention. She kind of refuses to be kind of scrutinized and to be kind of to take up the mantle of being a writer in the world. Whereas, you know, my unnamed narrator is this kind of he's a bit of a shit, and he basically just wants to kind of like attain the status of being a writer without actually writing. And I think Ruth acts as this kind of pivot point between these two kind of ideas. And I guess, you know, it was really fun to kind of play off these three characters against each other and to kind of like see how these ideas could kind of clash and be contested and be kind of confirmed in different sorts of ways. Yeah.
And Ruth deals quite comfortably with her measure of success.
Yeah, and I guess she has, you know, the normal ethical qualms of anybody who is I think it's kind of like, in earlier drafts, perhaps I thought the Ruth character was perhaps she was a bit too good, if you know what I mean. Yeah. And I had to kind of make her a bit more complicated and make her kind of more ethically dubious, because part of the novel is about, the narrator's form of his idea of how he gets success is a very particularly masculine and, one might say colonial form of, it's very extractive, it's very kind of like he's taking, he's extracting, he's like subsuming this other story, and like part of this novel is sort of exploring a sort of masculine idea of like success, projection, shame, all of these ideas. And I think like, he projects onto this Ruth character a lot of this ideal of what he thinks a writer should be. And of course his projection is like completely wrong. And like, I think it gets shown up in the end.
I want to go look at Brenda Shales. So you play on this idea of the reclusive, Australian writer in this imagined literary landscape, and Brenda being that person. Without them being noticeably reclusive, you bring to mind writers like Helen Garner, Elizabeth Jolley. Did they kind of inform the character of Brenda?
Yeah, well. That a lot of them did, and I guess like I was drawing from a lot of different kind of writers, all of whom have had a great influence on my work. And Helen Garner, I was always referring to her diaries when I was kind of creating the voice of Brenda. This kind of laconic, droll, kind of spiky style. And I actually was at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and I was in the green room, and I saw bloody Helen Garner, and I'm like, okay, I've got to do it. And I kind of went up and I told her about my book, and I'm like, you've inspired this character, and she's like, well, I bet she's a real bitch, isn't she? Which is very Helen Garner. It was very on brand. I really liked it. So there's a lot of her in there. There's some Elizabeth Harrower. She was kind of like, very big for a while, and she kind of was a recluse. Then there was Janet Frame. I think like the way that, she was kind of treated by kind of like medical institutions, that kind of comes into the Brenda Shales character as well. And, it was a really fun part of the novel was kind of imagining the books that Brenda might have written. And, I was always referring back to Elizabeth Jolley, you picked up, I was referring back to books like The Well, which are kind of these very opaque, beautiful texts, which kind of can be interpreted in a million different ways. Like, is The Well about, for those of you who don't know, it's about this kind of like older woman and young woman kind of living in the country. They may or may not kind of like run over a man and throw him down a well, but you're never really sure what's happening. And it's kind of like, is it about colonialism? It is about lesbianism? Who really knows? Maybe it's about all of these things. And it's kind of like, when I was kind of thinking of Brenda Shales's work, I was imagining these very kind of opaque, like endlessly analyzable texts. Yeah. So all of these kind of, I guess, female writers from that generation kind of found themselves into the character of Brenda Shales.
And do you think they come from a generation as well? I'm thinking in particular of someone like Helen Garner, where the writer didn't need to be a public figure.
Yeah.
The writer lived and died on their work alone.
Yeah, interesting.
Basically.
Yeah, well, like I think I'm not sure whether it was that different back then, but this novel is definitely, invested in this idea of kind of what are writers expected to do, and was it different kind of back then? And I think, I don't know, I guess like, Brenda's story is very bound up in like the Whitlam years as well, which is a period of history I've always been very, very interested in, and I think it says a lot about my generation as well, because we look back at the Whitlam years as this kind of pivot point where it's like the future of the country was kind of up for debate, and there seemed like there was a better future ahead, like a kind of socialist future or something like that. And so, it's kind of about processing my nostalgia for a period of time that I never lived through.
Yeah, it's got to say you weren't even alive.
No, exactly. But it seemed great. It seemed great, and maybe it wasn't. I don't know. Yeah. But like there was also this kind of, and I think like Brenda is a kind of vehicle for me to process that kind of relationship to history. And I also think the novel kind of, one of the things I think that really has changed about being a writer is like, I think it is much harder to be a writer financially than it perhaps used to be in previous generations, where like, I think back to like the grunge era of the 90s, where we have Christos Tsiolkas, all these other great writers who, they're just living on the dole, making books, being in bands, and like we have all of these artistic movements to thank, because basically, you could you could just sign on and make art. And like Helen Garner's thanked bloody Centrelink in like the acknowledgement sections of some of her books, and that's kind of unimaginable now. Like you have to be a professional, like you have to be kind of like able to speak in the public, you have to be able to kind of like have a social media presence. Like I don't think you can be a recluse these days as a writer.
Which leads beautifully into my next question. Is how do you as Dom Amerena feel about that? The writer as public figure. You mentioned, engaging with your audience, publicising your work, because writing is pretty solitary pursuit. We spend a lot of time on our own, and then we need to don a completely different suit and go out there and basically, because if it doesn't sell, then we're not going to be able to continue as writers. How do you feel in that space?
Well, it's very weird. I think I feel like I'm lucky enough that I can do it, as you can. But I have friends who are writers, and they find it very uncomfortable. They're kind of like they're like criminals being like interviewed by like the police when they're on stage, and like they don't want to give anything away. They're like, I'm not answering that question, Your Honor. And it's like it's very I feel for them, because it's like it is a big part of it, and it's a part that like I don't know. You don't think about when you're writing a book. You're not like, I'm writing a book so I can like sit on stage and talk about it. And like, it can be fun and it can be kind of strange as well. But, I was talking to Colm Toy Bean at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and he's like, we have to be the monks and the kind of performing bears. Like, we have to be able to sequester ourselves away and like then kind of come on stage when it's time to promote the book.
Yeah. Part of the attraction for me as a writer reading your book is the fun that you poke at what is a very small, and some would say incestuous, Australian literary scene, which I did think must have been like shooting fish in a barrel. But what extent do you feel the stresses and strains of living a literary life, the constant need to remain relevant, to keep producing, to keep selling? You've got an agent that's working for you. You've got a publisher that's breathing down your neck. How does that sit with you?
Well, I guess I don't know. It is weird. It's like we were talking about this off stage, but it's like I actually think the nicest part about being on book tour has been like meeting other writers who I've never met before, and being other booksellers and stuff like that, because it's a remarkably like supportive community. And I think like at a certain level, when you're starting out, it can be really tough because there's very, very little attention to go around. There's very little money to go around. There's few grants. There's few book deals, and like
which you seem to have done very well at. I've got to say.
Well, yes, maybe it's like I don't know. This is what it feels like to me. But I think I would say it can be like tough at the beginning to kind of not like feed into these kind of like negative feelings of like jealousy and bitterness, because like it inspires that, because like there's not enough to go around, and it kind of creates this kind of fight for attention. And I think one of the most heartening things of being on book tour has been realizing that like writers actually want success for each other as much as they want it for themselves. Well, maybe not quite as much as for themselves, but more or less, close enough.
And we spoke about this earlier, and that idea that just because your book sells doesn't mean my book won't sell.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
It works both ways. I've read a quote attributed to you that good writing comes from strong feeling, clear thinking, and an intuition that your writing needs to be in the world. Is that something that you are? What about in those darker moments where things aren't, flowing for you? How do you work your way through that process?
Yeah, that's
sort of going back to what we spoke about earlier, with a little bit more depth.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like, I've always thought, and something I kind of write about a little bit in the book, it's like, I think good writing or good novels for me, there's kind of combination of like the head, the heart, and the guts. And like, a lot of novels have, they're maybe a bit too cerebral. Other novels might be a bit too raw emotionally. Others might, lack the kind of like, I don't know, the might not give themselves permission to be cruel, or to be kind of like investigate the kind of like the darker parts of kind of our feelings and our relationships with each other. And I guess when I'm kind of writing, it took me a while to kind of have faith that you'll find that. But I feel like I do have that sort of faith now. But I think sometimes like writing that it doesn't feel that good and you come back to it a couple of days later and you'll just see like there's just something there that you like. Maybe it's just a line, maybe it's just a phrase, maybe it's like, I don't know, an idea for a scene that you could make better another time. But like none of it ever seems like a waste.
No.
And I guess it's like, you know, I think increasingly I've begun to think that like, you know, if you hang your sense of self as a writer or your sense of kind of worth as a writer on external validation, whether that's through book sales or, you know, reviews, fun conversations and stuff like that, you will eventually be disappointed because you will not ever get enough because it's so fucking hard to write a book and we're all kind of like, you know, we want it all. But if you can enjoy the writing process, then like it doesn't matter what happens in the end.
Yeah. I do find that when you review a manuscript, go back over a manuscript, we end up with 70,000, 80,000 words.
Yeah.
This is true for me. I don't know. I want to find out whether it's true for you. But when I go back and look at a manuscript, I can't tell the difference in the days where it worked and when I thought it was working and when I didn't. So in other words, the writing remains consistent. It's just our way in which we view that writing on that day that is different.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. And some writing you kind of love at the time and you come back to and you're like, this sucks. Or some you hate and you come back to and it ends up being like the best stuff.
Your editor points that out.
Yeah, or your editor. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, you know, I think that's definitely true. I don't think there's a kind of like a system that works each time. You just kind of have to know that if you sit down for long enough, it'll come eventually.
And if you've done it once, you can do it again.
Yeah, or 5 times in your case. Yeah.
I'm going to ask for questions from the audience in a minute. So if you have a question, we will have some roving mics moving around. Just be prepared, and I'm sure Dom will be happy to answer.
Of course.
Anything from any members of his family that are here. Which I understand as most of the audience. What happens when we talked about that sort of breaking through, and too often I think we take that breaking through as well. It's when you get a publishing deal.
Yeah.
It's when you get to a novel, but you can be a successful writer without having written a novel. But I do wonder what happens when you have that. So you were talking about that strength of conviction in your writing and feeling so strongly about it. But what happens if you still don't break through then?
Well, I guess, you know, going back to the idea of like, if you enjoy the process and you get some sense of satisfaction from
do you think that's true of most writers though, or is it the validation that we need?
I think it's both. I think you can't, like, I don't think you could write eternally without any sort of validation. And I think, like, you know, this idea of writing for oneself is good in some respects, but I think at a certain point you kind of want people to read your work.
It's cathartic to a point.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's like, you know, and I've had such frustration as well where, you know, like this book took me 5 years to write, maybe even longer. And like there were points I'm like, oh, it's never going to happen. It's never going to come together. I'm never going to get the deal, get it published. And like for it to kind of happen was, you know, it would be bullshit if I didn't say that it felt like amazing. Like it felt great. Like, and yeah, it doesn't happen for everybody. And so I feel very lucky that it has. Yeah.
Have we got the roving mics ready to go? Does anybody, I've got a couple more questions, but if anyone has a question for Dom, we'd be very happy to take it, and I can point out anyone. Yep. We just have to get the mic so that everyone can hear.
It's interesting you were talking about the process, and I remember listening to Robert Galbraith talking about the process, and he was very clinical in how he did that, and he planned and he plotted every chapter of his book.
Yeah.
So I'm just getting the feeling that you're a little bit more...
Yeah, well, worse at that, yes. To put too fine a point to it, but you know, I have heard that there are different types of writers, and some will work in this way where they build the house from like the ground up. They get the structure, they kind of like build the roof, and then they kind of like start filling in the details once the kind of structure of the novel is kind of in place. And that's one process. I don't work that way. And other people, they'll just make the room and they'll fill like every room with the furniture, and they'll get the wallpaper right, and they'll fill it in until it's like beautiful, and then they'll move on to another room.
Then they'll put the stumps in.
Yeah, exactly. And then it all falls apart. But for this next novel, I am planning, which is a very strange thing for me. But I know I'm just going to throw it out as soon as I start writing. But yes. What about you, Mark? Are you a planner?
No, totally not.
Really?
Although, because my most recent book was the first thriller that I've written, and I found that it was harder to write a thriller being a pantser, making it up as you go along, because you had to drop little Easter eggs. In some ways, your book reads as a thriller as well. Did you find you needed to do that? Did you need to go back and drop little Easter eggs in?
Well, it actually reminds me of, I heard this thing that Agatha Christie, when she was writing the book, she'd never know who the murderer was until the end, and then she'd be like, who is the most unlikely suspect? Now everybody, I maybe shouldn't have told you that, because now you're going to know who the killer is every time. And then she'd go back and kind of retrofit the novel to kind of make the ending work. And I did find myself doing that, where I was like, okay, once I found there's a few twists along the way, and once I kind of found what those twists were, I had to really kind of restructure everything.
Yeah. Any other questions? There's one over here.
Dom, that working with an editor, with the publisher,
Yeah.
How much changed from the manuscript that you gave them, they signed up, and to the end? Did you push back against some changes, and how long did that take?
Very good question. Well, I would say I had a pretty kind of finished, it was pretty polished by the time I gave it to them, and I'm also a kind of brutal cutter, so it was quite short when I gave it to them, and they actually wanted me to add more stuff back and kind of make it a bit longer. And I don't know, I was very lucky. I worked with Jane Polfeman, who's, she's a brilliant editor. She's worked with, basically all of Australia's greatest writers. So I'm very, very lucky. And she gave me back this thing. It was 32 pages of notes. I'm like, oh my fucking God, I'm going to have to change everything. But somehow it was all this stuff that I just had to tweak and little tweaks, and somehow it came from this collection of scenes to a very kind of well-structured novel. And I think editors, they really can structurally make the novel really sing in a way that I think we perhaps aren't as good at.
Yeah, I think I always think that at some stage writers are we're going to be called out on this, and it should be, written by Jane Polfeman, loosely based on the original idea.
Exactly. Yeah.
Any other questions down here?
I'm a listener, and I've downloaded it from Audible yesterday. Did you have any say in the narration?
I did. This is okay. You can't tell anybody this story, but okay,
it's being recorded.
Yeah. Okay, but basically, I haven't been a diva at all during this process, but I did get the kind of final 5 kind of voices for the audiobook, and I just 4 of them I just couldn't listen to, and one I was like, it has to be that one, and I'm putting my foot down, and that's the only one it can be. And I was very happy with it. I've listened to it. I think it's a great audiobook. Yeah. Have you had to do that?
I actually read it.
Oh, you read it?
Yeah, I read it. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
Okay.
Any other questions? Someone pointing over this way, over here.
Yeah.
Yep. There we go.
G'day, Dom.
Hi. How's it going?
Is this working? It is.
Yep.
At what point did you decide that you were going to be a writer? Was it a bolt from the blue or slow burn? And what kind of inspiration did you get back in the day?
Well, I guess I was always a reader much before I was a writer. I was always very voracious. I read everything. I read kind of Victorian literature. I read, I was always reading kind of I always remember Roald Dahl, all that kind of stuff. And I was always just all I did was read when I was kind of younger, and I guess it just seemed the natural extension of kind of that process. And I think it's also, it's one of the things I tell younger writers as well. It's you just have to read a lot, and eventually maybe you'll want to start writing. And I think the reading comes first, and so that's kind of perhaps what I think about. You know, there was never really a conscious decision. It just seemed an extension of this reading practice. Yes.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
That no author ever wants to answer. So.
Go on. Go on.
And that is, what comes next?
Oh, well. I do have an idea for a novel, which I can't speak about yet, but I have been taking notes for like quite a while, like for about, probably like since I got my book deal. Like it feels very strange. Like I know who the characters are, I know vaguely what's going to happen, so I need to kind of retreat into my little hole back in Greece and just start writing it.
And is that during that early process? Do you keep that entirely to yourself, or do you speak to your partner about it? Do you throw ideas around?
I think you can't talk about it too early. I think you have to kind of get it down on the page. But like one thing I'm going to do this time is like I'm writing a draft. Do you know what I mean? Like my terrible problem is I write 20,000 words and then I get stuck and I just start again, and I'm never doing that again. Yeah.
So slightly different process.
Yeah. No, it's going to be so easy this time. 6 months.
And having done it before, and you've been through this whole process now, and not just writing the book, but going out and selling the book, do you feel much more confident in going about it a second time?
Yeah, I think so. I know how to do it now. I feel, you know, I've often heard of the kind of second book blues where because, you know, when your debut, you have your whole life to write it, and then you get pressure to kind of write something quite quickly. But I'm kind of looking forward to it. I feel like, because I feel like I wrote 3 novels to write this novel, and so it's it doesn't feel like my first novel. It feels like the first successful novel that I wrote, and yeah, I think I feel much more confident.
So are there other novels in the bottom drawer?
Yeah, but I don't think that they shall remain there.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for this.
Thank you, Mark.
Great conversation, Dom. We're very pleased to have Cook & Young booksellers here selling copies of Dom's book, so you can purchase a copy and have it signed by Dom before you leave. He'll be at the signing table over to the side here. And of course, I Want Everything is available to borrow from the library as well. And we still get paid. We still get little...
Yeah, of course.
Those payments come through at the end of the financial year. ELRs and PLRs, they're godsend.
Love them.
Thank you for coming along, everybody, this evening. And on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries, we hope that we see you again.
Thank you.
Good.